Welcome to the April program, New Scotland Historical Association, which is co-sponsored by the Voorheesville Public Library. For those of you who have attended our programs at the Lyman House Community Center, the reason for the change is that, believe it or not, if you don't remember, today is the presidential primary in New York State. So if anybody's to blame for taking over the community center, it's the New York State Legislature and its wisdom as defined today as the presidential primary. I don't know anybody who's actually voted, but it is indeed the case. For those of you unaware of the New Scotland Historical Association, we're a not-for-profit chartered educational corporation organization chartered by the New York State Education Department. We're dedicated to the preservation of the history of the town of New Scotland. We're a membership organization. If you live in New Scotland or not a member, we encourage you to join. With most of our funding comes from memberships, and our programs are always open to the public at the Lyman House Community Center, and everybody's welcome to attend. My presentation tonight is on the Colonial Schenectady, Beyond the Pines. Our speaker is Mike Diana, who is the educator at the Schenectady Historical Association, or Schenectady Historical Society.
Schenectady County Historical Society. That's all the same thing. It counts.
Michael was born and raised in Guilderland, but we're not going to hold that against him. He studied history at Hamilton College and the University of Edinburgh. Since 2017, he has been the program manager at the Schenectady County Historical Society, and he's also an Adirondack 46er. So,
did I put that in there?
Yes, you did. Is that true?
Yeah. I'm still working on the winter 46. I thought I'd get it done this winter, but we had a weird winter, so it didn't work out.
Please welcome Mike.
Sure. Welcome everyone. I'm just going to do a quick volume check. Can you guys hear me if I speak at this level? Yes. Folks in the back, you all good? All right, cool. Because I'll try to be as kinetic as possible with this presentation. So it's a pleasure to see you all, and I do apologize in advance if I kind of go rambling on this subject. This is kind of our bread and butter at the Schenectady County Historical Society, and the focus of this presentation, I do say Colonial Schenectady. That's not entirely the case. We're actually going to be focusing on just one aspect. The first chapter, you might say, of Schenectady's colonial history. From when Schenectady itself is founded in 1661, right up to the end of that 17th century. So we're not going all the way up to 1776. There's a whole lot of the colonial period we're not going to touch today, if only because there's just so much to discuss in this very fascinating time period. And really what we're going to be trying to do is we're going to try to examine this society and the circumstances in which it developed. And really, it always is remarkable to try to get a sense for what this place would have looked like and sounded like and felt like, because even though this place is literally in our backyard today, it would have felt like a completely foreign environment 350 years ago when Schenectady was first being settled. So we'll try to recreate this time period as best as we can with the sources that we have all these centuries later. Before we can talk about Schenectady, though, again, we want to talk about the circumstances in which Schenectady was settled. We want to kind of, talk about the landscape, the political, the environmental landscape of the colonial period. And I want to start with this map right here. This is a map that roughly shows the distribution of Native American peoples prior to any Europeans showing up and setting up any colonies in this landscape. This is what the people of this area would have looked like, or the names that would have been relevant to them, right? And there's a lot going on here. You can see the modern boundaries, right, of New York State right here. And we'll forget about all that stuff, right? I have two colors coded onto this map, representing two different cultural groups, completely different cultural groups, right? We have on the orange colors, these are Algonquin peoples, right? Algonquin, that is a cultural and linguistic group, which will be separate from the purple. The purple are going to be our Iroquoian our Iroquoian cultural and linguistic groups, right? So kind of like how you can have, Germanic peoples in Europe versus Slavic peoples, right? Two different cultural and linguistic traditions. We have a similar demographic breakdown here. And then within those broader cultural labels, we have different political distinctions as well. Nations, tribes, peoples, whatever you want to call them. Folks like, well, the Mohicans, the Wappingers, the Delawares, names which you might still see on the map today, but you might not necessarily associate them with a group of people. But suffice it to say, all of these names had some cultural significance at this point in time. We're talking at the start of the 17th century, folks. The human history of this area goes back 12,000 years. I'm not even prepared to comment on the entirety of that history. This is just a snapshot of this place circa the year 1600, right? 1600. So we're not going to talk too much about the Algonquin peoples today, if only for the sake of time and brevity. But we're going to have to talk quite a bit about these folks here. Again, the Iroquoian cultural group. And more specifically, certain members of that cultural group. These 5 nations right across here, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. Now, these folks here, like the Susquehanna, the Erie, the Wenro, they're also part of this cultural group, but they were not formally part of this confederacy of 5 nations, which formed between these 5 right here. And remarkably, I can't even put a date to when this Iroquois confederacy, these 5 nations, joined together. That's actually a matter of significant scholarly debate. I've seen debates as recently as the 16th century, as distant as the 12th or even the 11th century. So when this confederacy came together is not entirely known, and I'm not here to adjudicate that issue, right? But suffice it to say, this confederacy was here, and it was powerful. It was a significant geopolitical presence when the first Europeans start to make their way to this continent. Now, of course, Iroquois is this term which gets applied to these people. Oh, the Iroquois people. Well, the Iroquois never called themselves the Iroquois. That is an exonym, right? That's what other people have called the Iroquois. Kind of like how we call the Germans Germans. Germans don't call themselves Germans. What do they call themselves? Deutsch, right? That would be the, that's their name for themselves. In a similar fashion, the Iroquois Confederacy here, they called themselves the Haudenosaunee. And that, of course, means people of the Longhouse. And there's more I could get into with that group of people. Again, this is not an exhaustive kind of cultural description of these people, but we have to be aware of them because they're going to be major players in our story today. But to be brief, this is what a typical Iroquoian village, again, Iroquoian in the cultural sense, Iroquoian village would have looked like. You might imagine this being one of the Mohawk castles, which would have dotted the landscape in the 17th century. Now, I use that term castles because when the first Europeans would see these things, they would see the palisade wall that would surround the largest, the principal villages of the Iroquoian people. Right? Not every village would have a palisade, but the biggest ones did. And within those palisades would be, well, the long house for which these people took their name. And you could imagine, up to 100 people, an extended family, a clan, living within one of these long houses. And, well, this village would control the surrounding countryside, which they would farm corn, beans, and squash. They would cultivate the fields surrounding their village. They would hunt through the streams and the hills and the forests surrounding their town. And if we go back to the map real quick, I should just point out, so we see these broad kind of territories carved up here, right? It's a little bit misleading in that this territory doesn't correspond to everywhere that these people were living simultaneously, right? There would be a heartland for each one of these 5 nations, and these broader territories would be the range of their hunting parties. They would be massive, long-ranging expanses that these people would control, even if there wasn't necessarily a Mohawk village right up there on the shores of Lake Champlain. For instance, if we just look at the Mohawk people, the heart of their people, at least in the 17th century, would be focused right here along this river, right? The Mohawks River. Kind of think of where Fonda, New York is today, if you want to, to put a place to this territory. But you could imagine, you could very well see Mohawk hunters and trappers and warriors ranging as far north as the modern-day border between New York and Canada, right? The St. Lawrence River. So that's all a very brief description, but we have to be aware of these peoples. Because when the first Europeans do show up, of course, the first European to show up around here of any significance would be old Henry Hudson himself, right? An Englishman, not working for the English, he's working for the Dutch West India Company, which has laid claim to, well, all of the West Indies, all of North America. That would be the Dutch kind of government granted a charter, a monopoly to this company that anything that was going to happen in this Western Hemisphere would be managed by the Dutch West India Company. So they had colonies down in the Caribbean, briefly down in Brazil, but they would also have a colony here in North America. And that got started with this voyage, 1609. Henry Hudson sails up this river. Now, we didn't call it Hudson's River back then, right? That'd be a little bit presumptuous. But nevertheless, this North River, that's how they knew it back then, this North River, Hudson thought that river might just take him clear through this continent and get to the other side, where he could sail all the way, all the way to the west and get to China or India. So he's looking to get to China, looking to get to India, maybe Japan. He had to settle for Troy, ladies and gentlemen. He got to Troy. And for the next 400 years, anyone else who has ever gone to Troy has gone there by mistake. So he really set the... okay, I love Troy. But no, he's traveling up the river, and the Hudson's River, this North River, it's a wide, deep river. You can take an ocean-going vessel about as far north as Troy along that river. At that point, that's when the river becomes difficult, or more difficult to navigate. You can't take an ocean-going ship like this with a massive keel any further north than Troy. First of all, you're going to run into some waterfalls, right? You don't really think of the Hudson River having waterfalls, but it does. It's just that we've dammed them up and put locks and levees all around them so you don't really notice them so much, but suffice it to say, they're there. I mean, you can follow the waterfalls all the way up to the shoulder of Mount Marcy, right? Lake Tier of the Clouds. So, Henry Hudson realized he couldn't go any further north along that river, and there was another river that joins up with the Hudson right around that area where he turned around. And in fact, this river would descend from the territory of the Mohawk people, so the Dutch quickly called it the Mohawks' Kill, right? The Mohawks River. Unfortunately, you can't go too far up that river in a boat like this either. And what's that? There's another waterfall, an even bigger waterfall, the Great Falls at Cohoes. So you definitely can't go up that fall in a boat like this. You could go down it, but you can only take that journey once, right? It'll be really fast and really exciting. So suffice it to say, that's kind of the limit of easy navigation along this river. And it's going to demarcate essentially the northern frontier of this Dutch colonial claim. So, whereas Henry Hudson did not find China or India, he did find these, right? Now, you can imagine the forests and the hills of, what would become New York State, vast tracts of woodland, which were relatively sparsely populated for the time, right? And beaver populations abounded in all the different natural areas of this place, right? Now, the native peoples very quickly learned, when they met with Hudson and those early Dutch explorers, they realized that the Dutch and the Europeans in general had a voracious appetite for these beaver pelts. You see, the beaver had virtually gone extinct back in Europe. There are European beavers, but by the 17th century, they'd been hunted virtually to extinction. Even today, their numbers are very, very low. So Europeans knew what beavers were, they just knew they didn't have any. And it's a simple thing in our primate brains that when something is hard to get, it becomes valuable. It can be useless, but it becomes valuable. Ladies and gentlemen, gold is one of the most useless metals out there. I mean, now you can put it in computers, yes. But for the majority of human history, gold is useless, but it's just pretty and shiny, and it's hard to get. So if you put that, on your ring or on your head, you can pretend that you're better than people, right? That's just how humans work. And it's a similar concept. These pelts being scarce in Europe, while abundant here in North America, they would be valuable back in Europe. And very quickly, these Dutch explorers worked out terms of trade with various different Native American peoples. All those peoples that I showed you on that map, anyone who had access to this Hudson River area, from the Mohicans to the Delaware or the Lenni Lenape people, and again, particularly the Iroquois, who, coming down that Mohawks River, could access the Hudson River as well, right? So this was the economic incentive that brought the Dutch to this area. Because you remember, they're traveling all around the rest of the world at this time period. They're going to, you know, modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia, that neck of the woods, where there's all these exotic spices, right? Or they could be out there looking for gold and silver. There's none of this cool stuff here in New York, right? There's just the beaver furs, and that's really what's drawing. Whatever Europeans show up here, that's what they're coming here for. That's the economic engine for this colonial settlement. So, the Dutch concluded different negotiations with all of those Native American nations that I showed you at the start. But again, we're going to have to focus on the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, and particularly the Mohawks. The Mohawks being the easternmost of the 5 nations, it was their role in the Confederacy to serve as keepers of the eastern door, right? And as the Europeans, as the Dutch started to settle along that Hudson River, the Mohawks became the chief intermediaries between the Europeans of the Hudson River and the rest of the Iroquois Confederacy. And the Dutch, for the most part, were not interested in conquest so much as they were interested in trade. They never had the numbers of people available to fight any long, protracted wars with any native peoples. They did have a couple of brief wars with the Delaware people. I don't want to forget about that. But those wars were ruinous for everyone, and the Dutch pretty quickly concluded that's not how they wanted to conduct business. Certainly not with the Mohawk people, who would very easily overwhelm anything that the Dutch could try to throw at them. The Mohawk were very powerful at this point in the timeline. So instead, they decided that peace and commerce could be the better option. And this right here is a belt of wampum, which in the Iroquois, and again speaking culturally, Iroquoian tradition, wampum serves as the basis of treaties, right? Of course, in the European tradition, we have, you know, written pieces of paper. You sign your name on the bottom of that, and then everyone's going to listen to the terms of that treaty, right? Well, hold on. This belt of wampum would serve the same purpose. And you would encode messages or symbols into the belt using these beads here. And you can have any color beads you want as long as they're white or purple, right? So that's really what you got to work with. And this is a famous belt, or I think it's a reproduction of a famous belt. I don't think I'm fairly certain this isn't the original one. But the Dutch concluded with the Mohawks an agreement, the 2-row wampum belt. And you can see the 2 rows right here. And the symbology here, again, the encoded message here, is that one path, one river for the Iroquois people, one path, one river for the Dutch people. They would continue along in parallel courses, close to each other, right? So they can do business, they can be friends, they can be within proximity to each other, but that these two peoples would not interfere with each other. And that was the original kind of terms of the trade that would be developed in the 16 teens and really the 1620s and 30s. This is kind of the relationship that was developed. It was far more profitable for both sides to trade. The Europeans wanted beaver pelts. Well, what do the natives want? What do the Mohawks want in return? I mean, all kinds of things, right? Like, well, European textiles would be a very valuable thing because, of course, you can take a beaver pelt, which is about, what, yay big, right? And you can make some kind of fabric out of that, sure. But you could take that beaver pelt to the Dutch, and they would trade you yards and yards and yards of European linen or wool cloth for that. And, hey, that sounds like a good deal to me, right? Or you could trade it for metal goods, right? There's no blacksmiths in the Mohawk villages, so they would rely increasingly upon Europeans for these metal tools like hatchets and knives and needleheads and all kinds of different tools which they could not reproduce quite so easily at home, right? Of course, gunpowder would be an increasingly valuable thing. Well, we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later, but gunpowder would be a necessary thing for the Iroquois increasingly, and they would really have one source of it, and that would be their European contacts in this colony that would become New York, right? So a variety of things that they could trade for. This is the Dutch colony as they kind of envisioned it. Again, we're talking the early 17th century here. And this map, it's kind of recognizable to a modern map. You can see certain things like, oh, there's Long Island right there. Here's that North River, that Hudson's River. Here's the Connecticut River, known then as the Fresh River because it's fresh water. The South River over here, that's the Delaware. It is south of the North River. That's really what they both go to the north, right? But it's north and south, right? So this is the territory that the Dutch West India Company had kind of envisioned itself controlling. Of course, that control existed entirely upon this single piece of paper, right? There really is no reality to the Dutch presence here, wherever this is, right? There's no Dutch villages there. It really just is this axis right here and a little bit of control over here down on the Delaware River. Incidentally, the Dutch kicked out another colonial power that had a territory here. Does anyone know what I'm talking about down here on the Delaware River?
New Sweden.
New Sweden. Everyone forgets about New Sweden. But they got kicked out by the Dutch, and well, you know, I guess when you think about it, everyone was fighting over control of New Jersey. Was it really worth it, guys? So that's the Dutch colonial world, at least the Dutch colony of, well, here you see Novi Belgii, or the New Netherlands, right? So that's how they thought of it. You can see a kind of a fanciful rendering of an Iroquoian village, at least that's what I assume that is, or with the long houses and the palisade walls right there. In reality, what it would look more like is this, right? And even this is kind of an overstatement of the degree of control. Just imagine a thin band of Dutch presence along this Hudson's River with a handful of notable settlements. Certainly down at the mouth of this river, we have New Amsterdam, which would become the most important of these settlements, right? It would serve as the entrepot for this colony. Anything coming in or out of this colony would have to go through this ocean port down here in New Amsterdam. Kind of about halfway up, they built a little town called Wiltvik, Kingston. Of course, that would be towards the end of the Dutch colonial period. And then all the way up there in the north, like I said, the northern frontier of this Dutch colony, that's where you get a little fort called Fort Orange. That was built in 1624 to control this confluence of these major waterways, particularly the Mohawk, the Hudson, but also like the Hoosic River and all these other kind of tributaries that feed therein. This is a natural crossroads. Just that's the way the geography and the hydrology of this area is. This is the natural crossroads, and the Dutch built their fort there, Fort Orange, in 1624. Surrounding that fort, a small little town developed, and the protection of this fort, known to the Dutch as Beverwijk, which of course is Dutch for Beaver Town. Beverwijk, Beaver Town. Now Schenectady's up there too, but we're not at Schenectady. That spoiled it. Sorry, Schenectady will exist, folks, at some point in this presentation. And again, for all you Swedes out there, there's New Sweden. It's on the map too. There you go. It existed. So here's that city, or that town of New Amsterdam, roughly as it would have existed around the year 1660. Again, much smaller than it is today. I do believe that this would be Wall Street, so it really is just the southern tip of the island of Manhattan. Much smaller town back in those days. Right? We're not focusing on New York City today. Here is an artist's rendering of what that Fort Orange may have looked like. Again, on the far extremes of this small little Dutch colony, as they thought of it, kind of on the edge of civilization altogether. Kind of a very, ethnocentric way to think about it, but nevertheless, this was their little fort, as rendered by Len Tentillo. Does anyone know Len Tentillo? Excellent artist, and this is his drawing of what this may have looked like. Now, I want to briefly talk about this side that the Dutch are transplanting to this new world, to this North American continent, right? It is essentially a feudal society, or at least as best as the Dutch can reproduce a certain type of feudalism here in this landscape. And it starts, I think it was 1629, the Charter of Exemptions and Privileges. The Dutch West India Company, which had a very difficult time populating this colony because no one wanted to come here. So they created these huge land grants, which they called patroonships. And principal investors in that Dutch West India Company, as a reward for their investment, would get these huge tracts of land, which they could manage more or less like a feudal landlord. Anyone that they transplanted to their patroonship would have to pay them rents to live on that land. It is essentially feudalism trying to be reproduced in the Hudson River Valley. Of course, most of these patroonships were unsuccessful. And in fact, this right here, by the way, if you're wondering what this is the Philipsburg Manor. The Philipses were one of these early kind of patroon families. They may have actually been manor lords. They may not have gotten their start in the Dutch period as major landowners, but they are a Dutch family. I just don't really know when they got their manor established. But the most important of all the patroons would be these guys, right? The most successful of the patroons would be the Rensselaers. Kilian van Rensselaer, a original director of the Dutch West India Company. This isn't his house, but this is Colonial Historic Society, which would be a Rensselaer house built in 1707, technically after the period that we're studying, but there really aren't very many buildings from the period that we're studying. In fact, there are no buildings from the period that we're studying, so this will have to do, right? The Rensselaers were granted a huge patroonship. Essentially, all the land surrounding that town of Fort Orange, the fort of Fort Orange and the town of Beverwyck, all surrounding that would be the Rensselaerwyck Manor, or the Rensselaerwyck patroonship, right? And anyone who lived within that patroonship would have to pay rents to the family. Now, Kilian van Rensselaer never set foot in North America, but he had all this land and all these people. He was one of the few patroons who was successful in moving people into this new world. So he had all these people that needed to be managed and rents that needed to be collected, and if he's not going to come over here and do it, he's got to get someone to do it for him. And he went through a number of kind of agents who would manage his vast tracts on his behalf, but one of his more successful agents would be his nephew, a guy named Arndt van Curler. So Arndt van Curler, relative to the patroon, right? So he's a well-connected guy. He comes here ostensibly to run his uncle's business, more or less, right? Collect rents from all of his uncle's tenants. But really, at the same time, he's trying to pursue his own interests and build up his own holdings in this area. And for a time, he has a farm. He has a bowery, as the Dutch would call it, just north of where Beverwyck would be, where Albany would be, right? Unfortunately for him, that burns down at some point in the 1650s, which is a big setback for him. Now, for the whole of that decade, the 1650s, he's got this project in mind. In fact, he's got his eye on this parcel of land along the banks of that Mohawks River, right? And so you got to imagine, if this is an Albany perspective, this is a Beverwyck perspective. If you look up towards the hills above the Hudson River in Albany, you'll start to see these pine barrens which stretch for miles and miles. This pine bush, some of which still exists today, right? The rest of it is Crossgates Mall. But some of it still exists. And beyond those pines would be a little flat piece of land on the Mohawk River. And this came to his attention because the Mohawks knew that very well. The Mohawks would use that as their portaging place. You see, imagine, they're coming all the way out from Fonda. They're riding their boats, their canoes, all the way down from Fonda, down the river, to get to Albany. But they know darn well that you don't want to go over Cohoes Falls. In fact, you don't want to go any further east than that great flat, about 20 miles above Albany. So they would get out at that place beyond the pines. They would walk all the way the heck into Albany, right? That's 20 miles one way, do all of their trading, and they're carrying a bunch of stuff, right? They're coming here to trade. They got to carry all that stuff back, put it back on their boats, and schlep on back to where they came from. So that's a long journey, right? And yeah, these Mohawk traders, they were track stars. They could do these long voyages, these long journeys, but it did impose difficulties. And in the 1650s, the fur trade was having difficulties. Again, it's a commodity market, and it's just the same way that economics works today. Certain times the price of a commodity can be high, certain times the price can be low, right? And when the price is low, that's usually bad news for everyone involved in that trade. And the 1650s were, for a lot of reasons, a rough time for this transatlantic fur trade between the Iroquois people and their Dutch contacts in Albany. So Van Curler wanted to build a settlement on that great flat, that place beyond the pine barrens, place beyond the pines, right? Where the Dutch could meet the Mohawks. They wouldn't have to do that portaging into Albany, and the Dutch could, kind of carry the burden from there back to Albany and kind of make things easier for everyone. Of course, that's just what Van Curler is telling everyone. What he really wants is he wants to be that first guy to have that easiest access to the Mohawk traders coming down the Mohawk River. Because whoever has that first access gets the first choice of all the furs. It's a very easy way to make a lot of money. And he's not fooling anybody, right? The Albany merchants, who had dominated this trade for, since 1624, right? They know that anyone who's going to set up shop on that great flat is going to threaten their control of that trade. And they know that's what Arndt van Curler wants. However, the decisive argument comes as the population of Beverwyck, of Albany, grows and grows, the farmland surrounding that town is insufficient to feed that population. And they recognize that the Great Flat has this big tract of, fertile land which could feed this growing colony. And so, in 1661, Arndt van Curler gets permission from the European authorities, the Dutch authorities, and then he also negotiates permission with the Mohawks. He was a keen and shrewd negotiator with the Mohawks, and the Mohawks greatly respected him for that. So he negotiates with the Mohawks that the Dutch can settle upon this Great Flat, this place beyond the pines, and so Schenectady gets its start. But that really just is the start, folks. Part 2, settling Schenectady. So, this is the earliest map that we have of Schenectady. And it's a great map. And we're going to return to this map towards the end of our presentation, because this is actually a map not from 1660. I wish I had a map from 1661 when the town got started, but no one made a map at that point in time. This map is actually from the I think it's 1698, but it's kind of at the end of our period of study here. Now, you might feel turned around right here. Let me give you a hint. This is north. That's east, west, south. And that's just how the map maker did it, right? The conventions of map making were different in the 17th century. No, there was no rule that north had to be on top, right? So this is the Mohawk River. It's going, kind of roughly, mostly east, a little bit north here, but you also have a small kind of offshoot of the Mohawk River. It was known as the Binnekill. That's Dutch for the inner stream, because what happens is, you can't see it on this map, but it separates out from the Mohawk River, loops back around, comes back this way. And that would be important, because whereas the Mohawk River has quite a bit of a current, right, this inner stream, this Binnekill, is a much more gentle place. And this would be the prime dock space for this early town of Schenectady. You would see another creek right here, the Cowhorn Creek, which nowadays probably flows under the basement of every business on State Street. It's still there, it didn't go anywhere, they just put a culvert over it. Back in the 17th century, this would be your source of industrial power. And again, the real power that you needed was for a grist mill, which is highlighted right here in yellow. I don't know why it's highlighted in yellow, but it's convenient right now for it to be yellow. And that grist mill would process everything coming from this right here. You guys can kind of see on the map, what's this? Crops. Crops, right? This is farm space. From here all the way down, you guys know where Rice Road is. If you guys have been to Rotterdam Square Mall anytime? Well, this is, from here all the way down to that exit is the farm space. And the first 15 proprietors of this town, right, there's 15 patentees, Arndt van Curler, 14 other households, are coming to this place. And everyone would get a townhouse lot and a Bowery lot, or a farm space. And if you were, if you were wealthy and well-connected, like Arndt van Curler, he had the farm that was like right here. If you weren't so lucky, you'd have to be walking all the way down to Rotterdam Mall to, harvest your wheat or whatever. So again, this is the town. You can see, on this map, you can see a small little palisade wall. You guys see that right here? And it's kind of reinforced with a small blockhouse. That would be the northeast corner of the town. A lot of people, when they envision early Schenectady, they envision it enclosed on all four sides by a palisade wall. That's almost certainly not what it was, even though it's been represented that way for hundreds of years. That's most likely not the case. This is the original wall as it existed, starting from the Mohawk River down here, going up to the blockhouse, down, closing off. This is the eastern section of town, down to the river, to the creek right over here. Right, so it's not some grand fortification. In fact, a determined attacker, not only can they probably plow right through this, they can also walk around it if they really, really needed to. This palisade did more good to keep wild animals out and domestic animals in as it did as any kind of formidable fortification. What else is important here? You guys might be wondering what this red thing is over here. This is the proposed fort, which was never built. Romer, the last name Romer, that's the guy who made this map. He was a military engineer, and he was making a recommendation that they put a fort right here. They never did. It'd be cool if they did, but they didn't. What else is important on this map? This is one last thing we're going to talk about with this map is this road right here. Now, folks, this is modern day State Street, right? This is Route 5. Nowadays, you continue along the road across that bridge into Scotia to go to Jumping Jacks, right? Well, this would be the road back into Albany. And again, that's kind of the logistical rationale here, is that the Mohawks can trade their furs here, and these Schenectady merchants would kind of forward them along to the merchants in Albany, right, who still expected to retain control over this fur trade. Of course, you know, the people in Schenectady have other ideas about that, right? So it's not something of a rivalry, with Albany having the privileged political position and Schenectady having the privileged geographic position when it came to control and access to the fur trade. So that is what Schenectady would have looked like in its earliest days. Now, don't tell anyone that you saw this here, folks. This is a brand new work by Len Tantillo, just commissioned, just completed. In fact, we're having a gala. The Schenectady County Historical Society is having a gala next Tuesday where we're supposed to do a big unveiling of this painting. You guys are getting a sneak peek. My boss doesn't know that you guys are seeing this here, so don't tell anyone that you saw it here. So this is Len Tantillo's depiction of what Schenectady would have looked like in this 17th century period that we're studying, right? And you can see again the kind of the stockade wall there on the outskirts, coming down to the river here, a small little dock space here. It's a small village, right? It's not some bustling metropolis, but it is a vital trading post. It is particularly the point of first contact between the Dutch colony of the New Netherlands and the Iroquoian world beyond, the Five Nations, the Haudenosaunee people. So Schenectady men and women would serve as interpreters and brokers of deals between these two different geopolitical players. And I do say women, that's not just like me being like a millennial, being like, oh, women were involved too. No, folks, the Iroquois people, you know, they have a very specific role for women in their society. The society is, in fact, matrilineal. So women have a certain degree of prestige, which maybe they didn't enjoy in European circles at the same time. So you would have these marriages of convenience in a lot of cases. You know, European men, Dutch men, marrying Mohawk women who would come to live with them here in Schenectady. They would produce offspring who would be half Dutch, half Mohawk. They would have, you know, kind of one foot in one world, one foot in the other simultaneously. And they would serve as intermediaries and interpreters. Folks like the Van Slyke sisters, Leah and Heletje, two granddaughters of a Dutch trader here, they served as interpreters and traders, and we have their mark on a lot of important documents from the 17th century. It wasn't really official until the Van Slyke sisters had approved it and made sure that everyone was dealing fairly with each other, that the translations were correct, that the Mohawks knew what was being agreed to, and that the Europeans knew what was being agreed to. So again, this is the role that Schenectady plays as a place of first contact. You'd have Mohawks living, like, you know, they would have extended stays in Schenectady. They might have small dwellings here that they would live in. You know, not all the time, but, you know, for weeks at a time. Because when you're coming all this way into Schenectady, you're not just going to like spend the night and go home, right? You're going to be there for days upon days to do whatever important business it is you had to do, and only then would you leave. You also got to, you know, you got to recuperate for the journey back. It's a long journey. So it's probably a very interesting and fascinating place. If only we could kind of see it firsthand, you know, hear the languages that would be spoken at the same time. I mean, Dutch would be the, well, for lack of a better term, Dutch would be the lingua franca of this town, but you would also hear Mohawk being spoken, you know, on the streets. You would have other Europeans as well, right? So the Dutch settlers were only maybe 50% ethnically Dutch. You'd have other Europeans from other countries, like the Scandinavian countries and France and the German principalities that existed at the time, and the British Isles that would be coming to this colony as well, for one circumstance or another. But Dutch served as kind of the greatest common denominator for the Europeans in this town, including the Dutch church, which you can see right here on in the background of this painting. You know, it was a pretty sectarian time, so I could imagine that a Scottish Presbyterian might be grumbling quite a bit, having to take communion in a Dutch Presbyterian church, even though they're like exactly the same. But nevertheless, they might still have, they have no other choice, right? Dutch serves as the greatest common denominator. Now, real quick, I mean, Schenectady was built in 1661. In 1664, pretty important shift happens, and that is when the English seize the Dutch New Netherlands and rename it New York. Now, in fact, the Dutch win the war in which they lose New York, but they seize a much more valuable English possession in the Caribbean, because for all the wealth that these beaver pelts could generate, the real money was in sugar. In the 17th century, if you had a sugar plantation, just a small little island in the Caribbean, you know, it could be a fraction of the landmass that the Dutch controlled here in New York, right? But that small little island could produce so much more wealth, so much more value. So the Dutch, they actually conclude that war on favorable terms for themselves. But they're happy to trade little podunk New York for this sugar colony. And there you can see that's the last Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, realizing that he doesn't have the capacity to fight the English that showed up in the harbor there. And he decides to surrender on the condition that they build a shopping plaza named after him in about 300 years. Only then, so you know, they honor the terms of the treaty. So, you know, this Dutch colony of the New Netherlands is now the English colony of New York. And that doesn't change a lot on the ground for people, right? It's kind of like the same stuff under new management, more or less. Certain things get renamed, like the colony now becomes New York. The city of New Amsterdam becomes the city of New York. The city of Beverwijk becomes the city of Albany, right? Wiltwyck becomes Kingston. Schenectady, they never changed Schenectady's name. And I didn't explicitly say that, but again, Schenectady is a Mohawk word, which means place beyond the pines. Again, owing to that kind of geographic kind of distinction there, right? Place beyond the pines from Albany. So, with the English in charge, even the patroons retain their position. Like the Rensselaers are just re-granted their patroonship as now an English manor, right? So now they're now the manor lords of Rensselaerwyck, not the patroons. But society more or less looks the same. It's just the taxes, you know, eventually filter their way back to the King of England rather than the Dutch States General, right? So I talked to you a lot about Arndt van Curler, who was again that kind of charismatic leader, that titular founder of Schenectady. Well, he pretty quickly removes himself from the picture. In 1667, he's on his way up to Canada, and he drowns in Lake Champlain under kind of mysterious circumstances. There's a lot I could get into there. I'm not going to bother. But he drowned, so he's dead. And so without him, there's something of a lack of leadership in Schenectady. You could have imagined an alternate timeline where Van Curler lives. He kind of serves as the leader of this village for the next couple decades. But that's not what happens. And so instead, a certain type of very weak and informal government is created. And that's by a charter in 1680. A town isn't really a town until it has a charter. And now that the English are in control, that charter has to come from the King of England. Right? And it's not until 1680 that the Dutch get a charter. They have to renegotiate the terms of settlement with the Mohawks, pay them more trade goods to kind of stay there. And the people who put up that initial investment, there's 5 men who put up the investment there, again, to pacify the Mohawks, to kind of cement this charter, and they become the trustees of this town. And one of the principal trustees would be none other than the Glenn family. There's a guy named, Alexander. Alexander Lindsay Glenn is the progenitor of the Glenn family in this area. In fact, he's from Scotland. Remember I was talking about folks from the British Isles? You know, this is a Scottish family who are coming in. They built their homestead not within the town itself, but just across the river. They named their homestead Nova Scotia because they're from Old Scotia, right? And that name still sticks today, right? We just dropped the Nova part. It's Scotia, right? And that's not the house that Alexander Lindsay built for himself. He built his house much closer to the river, and it kept flooding every year. So his son, in 1713, rebuilt this one. And if you want to visit this house today, you can, but you just have to have a wedding there. You just have to get married, because that's now a banquet hall, right? You can see it right there when you get into Scotia. In 1995, they built up all around it. This is still visible, but you have to look really hard. I'm not mad about it, but yeah, there you go. It's the Glenn house. Now it's known as the Glenn Sanders house, but first it was the Glenn house, and then it was the Sanders house. It was never the Glenn Sanders house, regardless. So we have this trusteeship system of government, but government is probably too elaborate a word because there really is no municipal services, right? There's no government doing things. What the trustees really do is they control the common lands, like the land surrounding the town that no individual person owns, but everyone is welcome to use perhaps for grazing purposes or as woodlots or for hunting purposes, right? The trustees control that land, and they can sell parcels of it off. Of course, what happens to the money that is generated from the sales, no one really knows. There's really no accountability here. It's all entrusted to the trustees, right? And the Glens would be one, the Skirmahorn would be another family, the Tellers were one, well, the other two, we don't care about them. But again, the trustee system of government. But for the most part, life is centered not around any kind of government, but it's centered around the household, right? That's what life looks like in the 17th century. First and foremost, it is a typical household would look like this. This is the Yates house in Schenectady, one of the Yates houses in Schenectady. The Yates had a lot of houses in Schenectady. This is one of them. This is the oldest one, 1725. So it's built after the time period that we're studying, but it is still representative of the architecture of this time period, right? And this house has been built up over the generations. What you can see, when I call this a Dutch colonial house, that term gets thrown around a lot by like real estate agents. Oh, this Dutch colonial house was built in 1925. Forget about that, folks. This is an actual colonial house built by a Dutch person. And the kind of the signifier is this gable. You guys see this triangular shape that you can see right here? This is what we call the gable of the roof. And in the Dutch architectural tradition, the gable will face towards the street. It will be perpendicular to the street. English houses have gables too. It's just that they are typically parallel to the street. So you have to kind of go around the side to see them. And this sounds like a pedantic architectural detail. And I hate pedantic architectural details. That's not the kind of history that I'm interested in. But this is important because it is a signifier of the cultural composition of this town. Even in 1725, 60 years after the English have taken over this colony, you can see that the Dutch architecture persists. And you can't see that in this picture, but the Dutch language and the Dutch customs persist well into the 18th century, right? So a Dutch colonial household, just like this. Another example of this architectural tradition would be this right here. This is the Maybe farmhouse, the oldest house still standing in Schenectady County, built in 1705. We own this house. We operate this house. You can come visit this house. Not tomorrow, but we have a program on Friday and Saturday if you guys want to come on out. This portion of the house is the oldest. It was built in 1705. It was built by the Maybe family. The Maybes would live there for the next 200 years. They would own it until 1993 when they gave it to us, the Historical Society. So this house has a lot of different stories, but today we're just using it again as an example of what a typical household would look like. And again, their economic activities would be predicated on agriculture and fur trading. Fur trading makes you money. Agriculture puts food on your table, right? And we already kind of talked about how everyone in the village of Schenectady would have, all of the principal landowners in Schenectady would have a farm lot. Even if they themselves didn't farm it, they would have someone farm it on their behalf. And when I talk about, life was based around the household, I use that term instead of family, right? Because these households included more people than just your blood relatives, right? You could typically have servants inside a household. You could also have slaves, enslaved people in a household as well. And a lot of people don't think of slavery as a thing that happens in upstate New York, but suffice it to say, slaves made up a significant portion of Schenectady's population. As soon as we get, hard numbers, the first federal census of 1790, I know that's well after the period we're studying, but 8% of Schenectady's population was enslaved in 1790. That's 1 out of every 12 people. So essentially every household was likely to own between 1 and 5 enslaved people who would live and work at that household as well. So again, this household includes more than just your blood relatives, and it is organized just like the rest of society is organized in a strictly hierarchical way, with the King of England and his nobles and the freeholders and the free landowners, I should say, and then the free people who maybe don't own land, and then different types of bound laborers, servants, and enslaved people on the bottom of that hierarchy. Well, within the household, that hierarchy is perpetuated, again, with the kind of the patriarch, the husband, serving as the head of the household. The wife, she has some authority too, and then kind of just working its way down to the lowest, the servile classes within the family as well, right? So that's, typically, wherever you look in history, the way that we conduct our households and our families typically mirrors the way we expect our society to run and vice versa. There's a certain kind of reflective equilibrium wherever you look with those things. So, inside one of these households, this is what you'd expect. one-room dwelling space about 20 feet square, built around a Dutch jamless fireplace, right? So that's 400 square feet for a household of maybe 10 people, right? And that's just what you expected in that colonial period. If you were a wealthy person like the Rensselaers or Art Van Curler or even the Glens, you could have a multi-room household, right? But for most people, having more than one room means more than one what? Fireplace, which means you need twice, 3 times as much firewood to keep that sucker running. And one of these fireplaces can consume an acre's worth of woodland in a given calendar year. So you got to multiply that by however many rooms you have. So for most families, really you don't need any more than one living space, one room, one fireplace, one hearth, I guess would be a good word for it, right? This would be a modular space, right? This would be your eating quarters, your sleeping quarters, your living quarters. For the most part, you know, since there's a lot of work that went into running a farm like this, most of the time you're spending outside in the warm months. It's not until the cold months where you really have to kind of hunker down in here, you know, find some way to occupy your time. There's still a lot of things to do, it's just you got to do them inside, right? So this is what one of those households would look like. Now, this is one of the very few contemporary renderings of a Dutch colonial household. This is the Van Bergen overmantel, which was painted in 1735. So again, it's not from the 17th century, but it is really the only colonial depiction of a typical household, a typical farmstead, I should say. So these folks, the Van Bergens, you can see them right here. I zoomed in on these guys. They're in the middle of the picture. They were not wealthy aristocrats, but they were landowners, right? You can see the whole of their household all throughout the lawn there. You can see the Van Bergens, front and center. You can see their kids. But if you look at these folks here, at least these two right here in the red and the yellow, they have dark skin. I can only assume that they were enslaved people brought to the Van Bergen household. Again, probably not directly from Africa, more likely indirectly, like perhaps those folks, their ancestors have been brought to the Caribbean, and they themselves have been brought from the Caribbean to New York. That's typically how this supply of human trafficking made its way all the way up here. But nevertheless, you can see the animals, the outbuildings that would constitute a proper farmstead, with the Dutch barn there in the background, the signifier of any farm worth its salt. Big, big barn, which we have one at the Navy farm, but you know, they're pretty cool in their own right. So that's what life looks like in the 17th century, and into the 18th century as well. But now I kind of want to talk about how this small little town would meet a pretty grisly end to this first chapter of its history. And for that, we have another Lentillo painting here. Before we get into the nasty stuff, here's a Lentillo painting for you, right there. And I think that painting is supposed to represent, you know, a winter's night in the year 1689, before calamity would befall this town. If you guys know what's coming, don't spoil it. Don't spoil it for anyone. I know what's coming. And it involves a continent in turmoil, all right? So we have these different geopolitical players, all with their own different interests and aspirations here in North America, right? So here's a map that shows the New Netherlands, the English holdings in Massachusetts, New Sweden. Hey, New Sweden made the map again. Yay, New Sweden. You get more Sweden representation for you. But for these folks down here, first the Dutch, and then later when the English controlled this as well, this holds true. The great specter to the north would be our good friends, the French Canadians, up in the St. Lawrence, right? While the Dutch and the English had their colonial projects going on down here, the French had their colonial project in the St. Lawrence River Valley, centered around, of course, Quebec, Trois-Rivières, and eventually Montreal, which I guess got its start as Ville-Marie. I didn't know that. There you go. That's how Montreal got its start. Now, the French have their ambitions, and they have their desire to extract furs as well. They're kind of coming for the same reasons as well, right? Get a handle on those furs. Now, Samuel de Champlain, famous French explorer, one of like the very first things he did, when he's showing up in this neck of the woods over here, he encounters some of those Algonquin peoples, right? Not part of the Iroquois Confederacy. Algonquin peoples who for a time had been at war with the Iroquois Confederacy. And this was back in like 1609. And these Algonquin people say, hey, French guys, you know, we see you got some really cool weapons we ain't never seen before. If you help us fight those dastardly Mohawks, we'll give you all the furs you want, man. And Samuel de Champlain's like, sure. So he joins with these Algonquin peoples in a big battle on the shores of Lake Champlain.
Oh my.
And Samuel de Champlain personally takes out an arquebus and shoots 2 Mohawk chiefs. And again, the Mohawks had never seen a firearm up until this point. And this painting probably doesn't do it justice. You see all these naked guys over here? These warriors would not be naked. They would be armored, clad in wooden armor, layered armor, kind of like lamellar armor, because that's how warfare was conducted until Samuel de Champlain shows up with his stupid musket and proves that armor is not very useful. Right? That's what warfare looked like before the Europeans arrived. It was armored warriors, not people running around in loincloths. So this battle, it's a catastrophic defeat for the Mohawks, who up to that point had been a rising power. And that kind of explains why they were so eager to cultivate relationships with the Dutch and then with the English after they kind of assumed control of the Dutch colony, is because the Mohawks realized that they now have to contend with these French folks coming down from the north. And they need a European power if they're going to do that, right? That's why the Iroquois, they were able to resist French encroachment and, you know, kind of project their power because they cultivated this important relationship, which they had a lot of agency in, at least in the 17th century, right? So to make a very, very long story short, there would be about, you know, a century of conflict from that first battle in 1609 right on through into the 18th century, really, but we're just talking about the 17th here, where the Iroquois Confederacy, the 5 nations, would often be in conflict with the French colony of New France, right? And there would be attack and counterattack, raid and counter-raid. The French really wanted the Mohawks to allow them to have missionaries in their towns. The Mohawks initially said, okay, sure, but then, you know, they kind of got mad when the missionaries, it wasn't just enough to convert these Mohawks to Catholicism. No, in order to be a good Catholic, Mohawks, you must come with us back to New France, back to Montreal, and live in our little communities where we can keep a good eye on you and make sure that you're doing the things that you want. And the Mohawks, that's the part that they objected to, right? They didn't want their people to be lured away by these strange people in strange clothing far, far away from their villages and their towns. And you may know that there was a couple of French missionaries, Jesuit missionaries, who were martyred or killed because the Mohawks had eventually had enough of all this, right? So that was another source of conflict as well, is Jesuit or Catholic access to Mohawk villages. So there's a lot we could go into here, but suffice it to say, you've got the Iroquois and their, you know, Anglo-Dutch allies. You've got the French and their native Canadian allies, their Algonquin allies, and these 2 alliances are pitted against each other for the better part of the 17th century. It wouldn't be 100 straight years of conflict, but it would be intermittent warfare again and again. Particularly whenever the Europeans would go to war back in Europe, these conflicts would spill into the colonies as well. All right? And as part of this conflict, let me just see here. As part of this conflict, in 1689, the Mohawks go up and they attack the French at a place called Lachine, that's a small suburb of Montreal. And they wipe that town right off the map. And a lot of people are killed. It's a big, gruesome scene. And of course, the people of Montreal are appalled by this. They want revenge. So they organize themselves. They pick up the pieces, you know, do what they can for the survivors. That's in 1689, at the end of the year. In February, or probably have to start in January of the next year, as soon as they can collect themselves and mount a response, well, they decide to march down and not seek retribution on the Mohawks. You see, attacking the Mohawks would be a tricky proposition, because if you send a small detachment of men, well, the Mohawks are going to defeat that small detachment of men. If you get a bunch, maybe a couple thousand French regulars to kind of, you know, march down to the Iroquois Confederacy, well, then the Iroquois are just going to disappear into the woods, and you're not going to get that decisive battle that you want, right? So it's kind of a tricky conundrum. And so the French decide instead not to attack the Mohawks or seek retribution on them for that Lachine massacre. They're going to go and they're going to attack Albany. Because if they can sever that connection, again, Albany and Schenectady serve as the connection between the Iroquois Confederacy and their Anglo-Dutch partners. Maybe if they can sever that connection, that will serve as a stern enough warning and in fact disrupt that supply chain that the Anglo-Dutch and the Iroquois had come to rely on. So it would be a huge strategic victory if they could just take or capture or burn to the ground that little town of Albany. So the French, about 100 Frenchmen, 80 native Canadians of various different affiliations, marched from Montreal through the snow and the ice, from Montreal down the whole of Lake Champlain, down the whole of Lake George, down the whole of the upper Hudson River Valley, until they get to just above Albany, right? Think of like kind of the Cohoes area. And they realize Albany is too well defended, too large a town for this group of 180 guys. They can't take Albany, there's no way. But they had come all this way. They can't leave without massacring somebody, right? So instead, they turn their attention to the small, much less well-defended town of Schenectady. And the people of Schenectady were not really taking any threats very seriously. They had, kind of gone to bed for the night. They had posted no guards. And to kind of add another layer of nuance to this, I realize I've been talking for a long time here, but there was a political crisis within the colony of New York related to the Glorious Revolution back in England. That's the whole story, right? But suffice it to say, no one in New York knew who the rightful governor was. There was this guy named Jacob Leisler who kind of assumed the governorship, and different people were pro-Leisler, different people were anti-Leisler. The people of Schenectady were pro-Leisler, the people of Albany were anti-Leisler. And so the Albany militia was not even welcome within the town of Schenectady on that night, February 10th of 1690. The people of Schenectady said, "No way, you anti-Leislerians. We don't want any of your business over here. We've got 13 guys from Connecticut, and they like Jacob Leisler as much as we do, and they're going to protect us from whatever is going to happen." Spoiler alert, guys, the folks from Connecticut, they weren't up to the task. Because when the French and Indians arrived to Schenectady again, they found the whole town asleep, no guards posted, and the gate on the northern end of town was left open. So they were able to just waltz right into the town, and at a given signal, the attack began. And it really was a massacre in the most basic sense of the word, right? People were being woken up to the sounds of screaming, bloodthirsty men in their homes, these small little one-room domiciles, right? Before they had time to arm themselves or dress themselves or even know what was going on, they were set upon by these bloodthirsty men. And people were just being cut down right there in their own homes, or maybe dragged out to the streets and killed there. It really was a pretty vicious scene. About 60 people would be killed, a further 24 taken captive, prisoners of war, and taken back to Canada. Now this image right here, I should point out, this is an artist's rendering of the massacre circa 1835. An artist named Samuel Sexton, who usually did portraits. And let me tell you folks, this image that he painted in 1835 is largely misinformed. Some details are correct, like, we even do have an account that this little baby did not survive, right? We know that that's a thing that happened. This baby got killed. This little dog got killed too, look at that. But what you'll notice in this painting is who's doing all the attacking? Indians, right? There's no Frenchmen in this painting. And not only are these Indians, these are like caricatures of Indians. This is a guy who has never seen an Indian before in 1835, painting an Indian, wandering around in February with these, thigh-high skirts on? Looking like, what the heck? Yeah, right? So, again, this is not what it looked like, but this is an enduring image. This is for centuries how people in Schenectady have thought of and considered the massacre, all right? Virtually every building in the town was burned to the ground. And the survivors of the massacre, they fled. Some of them in the night were able to get away and flee back to Albany, or it probably took them a good while to get from Schenectady to Albany. It's 20 miles through the snow and the ice and the darkness. And when they arrived in Albany, they would have been a sorry sight, half frozen to death, really, frostbitten limbs, I'm sure, terrified and traumatized by what had gone down. The buildings were destroyed. Even the Dutch church. These attackers had specific orders. Hey, guys, we're Christians here. We don't burn down churches. But they still burned down the church anyway, even though the governor specifically told them not to do that. They killed the minister. Again, the brutality of this really was, was pretty brutal, right? So this is the massacre, and this is, again, how it's been kind of depicted in popular culture hereafter. This is a sign that was first put up, I think, in 1925. But like in the last 5 years, they have since repainted it, re-gilded it, and put it back up, at the entrance to the Schenectady Historic District. And I'm not usually such an iconoclast, but I hate this sign. I think this is the stupidest sign, and I think it should be taken down. Because look at this caricature of a situation you have going on up there. I mean, folks, there was no siege of Schenectady. There was no stout defenders fighting off the savage hordes. I mean, that's what it is, right? This is a Cowboys and Indians version of the Schenectady Massacre. Look, this guy's even rolling up to the massacre in a canoe, right? Yeah, February 1690, showing up in a canoe to the battle. The more you look at this painting, or this depiction, the less informed you are, right? It's just ridiculous. But nevertheless, that's the image that endured. So in the aftermath of this attack, as the Anglo-Dutch were realizing the severity of the destruction, and the Mohawks were realizing the severity of the destruction as well. Again, there were Mohawks in the village of Schenectady on that night, and they were spared. And that might sound counterintuitive, because again, the Mohawks were the ones who had gone up and attacked Montreal. And I don't really know what's going on there. I think the rationale is that the French weren't trying to exterminate the Mohawks, they were trying to send a message. And the last thing they wanted to do was kill 20 more Mohawk people, and then they would guarantee a response from the Mohawks. The French were not worried about the English response to their attack. They were worried about the Mohawk response to their attack, because the English had no military power in this region to really counter with. The Mohawks did. But the Mohawks were just as devastated by this destruction of Schenectady, because again, Schenectady had been this crucial point of meeting between these two groups, the Anglo-Dutch and the Iroquois. And, I say this guy. There was a guy named Lawrence. Lawrence Ye Macass is how he's known in the documentary record. I'm sure that's not what his mama called him, right? Lawrence is not a Mohawk name, but he had been familiar enough in European circles. He had taken a baptism, maybe not because he fully, professed the faith of Christianity, but it was kind of like a token measure of communion that the Mohawks would do. These Europeans, they really like it when you take a bath in the water. It's a big thing for them. So we'll do it, yeah. And then Lawrence would be this kind of Christian name they would use in Christian circles, right? So Lawrence we don't really know what his position was. Was he a chief or what? He was a principal man amongst the Mohawks who were there in Albany and Schenectady. And he saw the scale of the destruction, and he rallied some of his compatriots, some Mohawk warriors, and some Schenectady men that went out after those retreating French and Native Canadians. They were able to inflict some retaliatory losses along the long, long march back up to Montreal. They had to turn around before they got too close to Montreal, right? Once the French forces get close enough to Montreal, they're safe. But they're able to inflict certain losses. But perhaps more important is Lawrence and other Mohawk leaders extolled the Anglo-Dutch to rebuild this town. And you can imagine a lot of the survivors were hesitant to do so because, this place was a smoldering, body-strewn ruin on February 11th, 1690. But it was important for both parties to rebuild this crucial connection between their peoples. And this wouldn't serve as the end of Schenectady's story, but just the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new story, right? The town would be rebuilt. It would grow into a city. In fact, it would be a further, 324 years of history to talk about thereafter. We don't have time to talk about all of that. But you can always come on down to the Schenectady County Historical Society, and I'll tell you all about it for a fee. I want to conclude with this map. Again, this is the Romer map from 1698. So remember, this is after the massacre. And in fact, you can even see evidence of the massacre in this map, because you can't read it, but that key, right, he's labeled certain important things. And when he talks about the palisade here, the fort and palisade burned. So you can see that even 8 years later, the burnt wreckage of that night was still lingering in certain places. Down here, I didn't point this out at first because this would not have been here in the 1660s or the 1670s. This is a small temporary fort that the English built to kind of serve as a refugee camp, right? Because again, all of the town here had been destroyed. Even 8 years later, not much of it had been rebuilt. There's just a handful of dwellings here, right? The people that were here wanted to be enclosed in a proper palisade just in case those French ever decided to come on back. So this small little fort existed there as a temporary shelter as the rest of the town was revitalized around it. So again, not the end of the story, just the beginning of a whole new series of stories. That's where we're going to conclude here tonight, folks. Thanks so much for your time.